On April 26, 1986, at 1:23 a.m., the world witnessed the worst nuclear disaster in human history. Reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in northern Ukraine exploded with force that would echo through generations. The explosion was not just a technical failure, but a catastrophic event that would expose millions to deadly radiation and forever alter the course of nuclear energy worldwide. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant was located near the town of Pripyat, approximately 18 kilometers northwest of the city of Chernobyl, in what was then the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. The facility consisted of 4 RBMK, 1,000 reactors, a Soviet-designed nuclear reactor that would later be identified as having fundamental design flaws. Each reactor was capable of producing 1,000 megawatts of electrical power, and by 1986, Chernobyl was one of the largest and most important nuclear facilities in the Soviet Union. The disaster occurred during a safety test that was ironically designed to improve the reactor's emergency procedures. The test was meant to determine whether the reactor's turbines could produce enough electrical power to keep coolant pumps running in the event of a power loss until emergency diesel generators kicked in. What the operators didn't fully understand was how dangerously unstable their reactor design could become under certain conditions. As the test proceeded, operators violated multiple safety protocols and disabled critical safety systems. They reduced the reactor's power output too quickly and too far, causing xenon poisoning that made the reactor increasingly difficult to control. In their attempt to raise power levels, they withdrew too many control rods, leaving the reactor in an extremely dangerous state. When they finally attempted to shut down the reactor by pressing the emergency stop button, a fatal design flaw caused control rods to briefly increase reactivity instead of decreasing it. The result was a catastrophic power surge that reached levels more than 100 times the reactor's normal operating capacity. The intense heat caused the fuel to fragment and react violently with the cooling water, creating a steam explosion that blew off the 1,000-ton reactor lid. A second explosion, possibly caused by hydrogen or a further steam blast, destroyed the reactor building and exposed the burning reactor core to the atmosphere. Burning graphite and radioactive material was ejected high into the atmosphere, and fires broke out across the facility. The graphite moderator in the reactor core continued to burn at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius, acting like a giant chimney that sent a plume of radioactive particles and gases into the night sky. This burning would continue for 10 days, releasing approximately 400 times more radioactive material than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The initial explosion killed 2 plant workers instantly, but this was just the beginning of a death toll that would eventually claim thousands of lives directly and indirectly. Firefighters and plant workers who responded in those first critical hours had no idea they were being exposed to lethal doses of radiation. They fought the fires with extraordinary bravery, many not knowing they were sacrificing their lives in those desperate moments. The explosion at Reactor 4 released a radioactive cloud that would spread across much of Europe and contaminate vast territories for generations to come. The radioactive materials released included iodine, 131, cesium, 137, strontium, 90, and plutonium, 239, each with different half-lives and biological effects. The total amount of radioactive material released was estimated at 5 to 12 times the amount released by the atomic bombs dropped on Japan in 1945. Iodine 131, with a half-life of 8 days, was one of the most immediately dangerous isotopes released. It concentrates in the thyroid gland and was responsible for a dramatic increase in thyroid cancer, particularly among children who were exposed in 1986. Studies have documented thousands of cases of thyroid cancer in children and adolescents who were living in contaminated areas at the time of the accident, a rate far higher than would normally be expected. Cesium-137, with a half-life of 30 years, pose a longer-term threat. This isotope behaves chemically similar to potassium and is absorbed readily by living organisms. It contaminated soil, water, and vegetation across vast areas, entering the food chain and continuing to expose populations decades after the accident. Even today, certain foods from affected regions in Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine can contain elevated levels of cesium-137. Strontium-90, another long-lived isotope with a 28-year half-life, mimics calcium in the body and accumulates in bones and teeth. This isotope is particularly dangerous because it can cause bone cancer and leukemia in exposed individuals. The contamination patterns were not uniform. Radiation spread in complex patterns determined by wind direction, rainfall, and other weather conditions in the days following the explosion. The radioactive plume traveled northwest initially, heavily contaminating areas of Belarus before shifting westward across Europe. Sweden detected elevated radiation levels on April 28th, 2 days after the explosion, and more than 1,000 kilometers away from Chernobyl. Swedish authorities initially believed their own nuclear facilities had experienced a leak until they analyzed the isotopic signature and traced it back to the Soviet Union. Within days, radiation detectors across Western Europe were registering elevated readings. Countries as far away as Italy, France, Germany, and even parts of the United Kingdom detected contamination from the Chernobyl cloud. In some mountainous regions where rain fell heavily during the passage of the radioactive cloud, contamination levels were particularly high and remained problematic decades later. The Soviet government initially attempted to conceal the scale of the disaster from both their own citizens and the international community. For nearly 2 days after the explosion, as radiation spread across Europe, Soviet authorities remained silent. It wasn't until Swedish scientists confronted them with evidence of massive radiation releases that the Soviets acknowledged an accident had occurred. The patterns of contamination created a checkerboard of heavily and lightly affected areas rather than simple concentric circles radiating from the plant. Some villages close to Chernobyl received relatively low doses, while others much farther away became hot spots of contamination. This complicated evacuation and decontamination efforts and meant that some populations received dangerous exposures before authorities understood the extent of the problem. The first responders to the Chernobyl disaster were firefighters in the nearby town of Pripyat, who had no idea they were confronting an enemy they couldn't see, feel, or fight with conventional means. Within minutes of the explosion, fire brigades arrived at the power plant to find fires burning across the facility and on the roof of the adjacent turbine hall. What they didn't know was that they were being exposed to radiation levels that would prove fatal within weeks. Lieutenant Vladimir Pravik led the first fire brigade to arrive at the scene. His team of about 20 firefighters began fighting fires on the roof of the turbine hall adjacent to the destroyed reactor. They climbed ladders to reach the roof, where chunks of graphite moderator from the reactor core were burning intensely. Not understanding what these strange black pieces were, some firefighters picked them up with their bare hands and threw them off the roof. These graphite blocks were intensely radioactive, delivering doses of thousands of Roentgens per hour. To put this in perspective, a dose of 400 Roentgens over a short period is typically fatal for 50% of exposed individuals. The firefighters on that roof were receiving many times this dose within minutes. Their protective gear, designed for conventional fires, offered no protection against the invisible radiation that was destroying their cells at the molecular level. Vasily Ignatenko was one of the firefighters who responded that night. Like his colleagues, he worked for hours without understanding the true danger he faced. Within days, he began showing symptoms of acute radiation syndrome, nausea, vomiting, and fever. He was evacuated to Hospital No. 6 in Moscow, which specialized in treating radiation exposure. Over the following weeks, his condition deteriorated horrifically as the radiation destroyed his bone marrow, damaged his internal organs, and caused his skin to blister and peel away. His wife, Lyudmila, stayed by his side despite warning from medical staff about the dangers. She was pregnant at the time but refused to leave her husband. She later described how he changed before her eyes, becoming almost unrecognizable as the radiation destroyed his body from the inside out. Vasily Ignatenko died on May 13, 1986, just 17 days after the explosion. He was 25 years old. Their daughter was born with serious health problems and died shortly after birth. Lieutenant Pravik and many others from his brigade met similar fates. Of the firefighters who fought the blazes on that first night, 31 died within weeks from acute radiation syndrome. These men are today recognized as heroes who prevented an even greater catastrophe by stopping the fires from spreading to the 3 other operational reactors at the Chernobyl site. The firefighter sacrifice bought time for a larger response, but it came at an enormous personal cost. Many of them were young men in their 20s and 30s with families who never fully understood until too late what they were being asked to face. The Soviet system that sent them into that inferno, without proper equipment or even basic information about radiation dangers, bears responsibility for turning heroes into victims. Their bodies were so contaminated with radiation that they were buried in lead coffins in Moscow's Minskoye Cemetery, and their graves remain radioactive to this day. The memorial to these fallen firefighters stands as a testament to extraordinary courage in the face of an invisible enemy and systemic failures that made their sacrifice necessary. The city of Pripyat was a Soviet showcase, a modern nuclear city built to house the workers of the Chernobyl power plant and their families. With a population of approximately 49,000 people in April 1986, Pripyat was considered one of the most prosperous and desirable places to live in the Soviet Union. The city featured modern apartment buildings, schools, a hospital, cultural center, swimming pools, and the famous amusement park with its iconic Ferris wheel that would become a haunting symbol of the disaster. When Reactor 4 exploded at 1:23 a.m. on April 26, most of Pripyat's residents were sleeping peacefully in their beds, completely unaware that their lives had just changed forever. The explosion was audible in the city, and some residents saw the fires at the power plant, but authorities provided no immediate information about what had happened or any warnings about radiation. On the morning of April 26th, children went to school as usual, people went to work, and life in Pripyat continued with an eerie normalcy. Meanwhile, Geiger counters throughout the city were registering radiation levels hundreds and even thousands of times above normal background levels. The invisible poison was everywhere, in the air people breathed, on the surfaces they touched, in the soil of playgrounds where children played. Some residents noticed strange tastes in their mouths, metallic and bitter, a sign of radiation exposure. Others felt nauseous or developed headaches, symptoms that were dismissed or attributed to stress or other causes. Authorities knew the radiation levels were dangerously high, but continued to debate what to do, afraid of causing panic and hesitant to make decisions without approval from Moscow. Throughout that Saturday, April 26, Communist Party officials and plant management argued about whether evacuation was necessary. Some pushed for immediate evacuation, while others worried about the logistics and political implications of admitting the scale of the disaster. All the while, every hour delay meant higher radiation doses for Pripyat's residents, particularly vulnerable children. It wasn't until late on April 27th, more than 36 hours after the explosion, that authorities finally announced an evacuation. Residents were told to prepare for a temporary departure of 3 days and to take only essential items. They were assured they would be returning soon. It was a lie. No resident of Pripyat would ever return to live in the city permanently. On the afternoon of April 27th, a fleet of over 1,000 buses arrived in Pripyat. In an operation that lasted just over 3 hours, the entire population was evacuated. Families boarded buses with minimal belongings, leaving behind pets, possessions, and the lives they had built. Many residents would later describe looking back at their city from the buses, not yet understanding that they were seeing their homes for the last time. The evacuation proceeded in eerie calm, with residents orderly and cooperative, trusting that authorities were managing the situation responsibly. What they didn't know was that they had already received dangerous doses of radiation during those 36 to 48 hours of delay. Children playing outside on April 26th and 27th received particularly high exposures. The consequences of this delay would manifest in elevated cancer rates and other health problems in the years and decades to come. In the days and weeks following the Chernobyl explosion, the Soviet Union mobilized an enormous workforce to contain the disaster and prevent it from becoming even worse. These workers became known as liquidators, a term that reflects their mission to liquidate the consequences of catastrophe. Over the next several years, an estimated 600,000 to 800,000 people would serve as liquidators, exposed to varying levels of radiation as they performed tasks deemed essential to preventing further catastrophe. The liquidators came from all walks of Soviet life. Many were military personnel, soldiers, engineers, and specialists drafted for this unprecedented mission. Others were civilian volunteers, though the term volunteer is complex in the context of the Soviet system, where refusing such assignments could have serious consequences. Still others were professionals whose expertise was deemed necessary: miners, construction workers, helicopter pilots, scientists, and medical personnel. The initial priority was extinguishing the graphite fire in the reactor core and preventing the melting fuel from burning to the reactor foundation. In the first days after the explosion, helicopter pilots flew hundreds of missions over the exposed reactor, dropping bags of sand, lead, boron, and clay onto the burning core. These pilots received massive radiation doses with each flyover, as they had to fly directly through the radioactive plume rising from the reactor. One of the most dangerous early missions involved draining water from bubbler pools beneath the reactor. Engineers feared that if the molten reactor core burned to the concrete foundation, it would hit these water pools and cause a massive steam explosion that could destroy the other reactors and release even more radiation. 3 men, Alexei Antonenko, Valery Bespalov, and Boris Baranov, volunteered to dive into the radioactive water in darkness to open drainage valves. Contrary to some dramatic accounts, all 3 survived the mission, though they received significant radiation doses. As the immediate crisis stabilized, attention turned to the monumental task of cleaning up the site. The roof of the adjacent Reactor 3 building was covered with highly radioactive debris that had been ejected during the explosion. This debris included chunks of reactor fuel and graphite that emitted such intense radiation that humans could only spend a few minutes in their vicinity. Military robots were initially deployed to clear this debris, but the intense radiation fried their electronics and rendered them useless. The authorities made a decision to use human laborers instead, in what would become one of the most harrowing aspects of the cleanup: liquidators, wearing makeshift protective gear that offered minimal protection against radiation, were sent onto the roofs in shifts lasting 40 to 90 seconds each. These biorobots, as they were grimly nicknamed, would run onto the roof, shovel radioactive debris into the destroyed reactor, and run back before their allotted time expired. During their brief exposure, they received radiation doses equivalent to what is normally considered a lifetime maximum. Each man performed this terrifying task only once, making a rotation of thousands of individuals taking turns in hell. Beyond the power plant itself, liquidators worked to decontaminate the surrounding area. They scrubbed buildings, removed topsoil, cut down and buried forests, and demolished entire villages that were too contaminated to be saved. The scope of this operation was unprecedented, covering an area that would eventually extend across thousands of square kilometers. With the reactor fire finally extinguished and immediate dangers addressed, Soviet authorities faced an unprecedented engineering challenge: how to contain a destroyed nuclear reactor that would remain dangerously radioactive for thousands of years. The solution they devised was the construction of a massive protective shelter that would come to be known as the sarcophagus. The design and construction of this structure presented problems never before encountered in human engineering. The destroyed reactor building itself was structurally unsound, contaminated with lethal levels of radiation, and contained approximately 200 tons of radioactive corium, the melted mixture of nuclear fuel, reactor components, and concrete that had formed during the meltdown. Workers couldn't spend more than a few minutes at a time near the most contaminated areas, making conventional construction techniques impossible. Soviet engineers designed a shelter that would be constructed mostly from the sides of the reactor building, minimizing the time workers had to spend in the most dangerous areas. The structure would consist of massive steel beams and concrete panels that would eventually cover the entire reactor building. Construction began in June 1986, just weeks after the disaster, and would continue for more than 6 months under extraordinarily dangerous conditions. Liquidators worked in shifts limited by radiation exposure rather than time. Construction crews would work until their dosimeters indicated they had received their maximum allowable dose, then be replaced by fresh workers. This rotation meant that the sarcophagus was built by a constantly changing workforce of thousands of individuals, each contributing what they could before reaching their radiation limits. The construction proceeded at a breakneck pace, driven by the urgent need to contain the radiation before winter arrived and by the Soviet system's emphasis on completing the project regardless of cost. By late November 1986, the sarcophagus was completed, a massive concrete and steel structure standing over 60 meters high and containing roughly 300,000 tons of concrete and 7,000 tons of metal. The sarcophagus was always intended as a temporary solution, designed to last perhaps 20 to 30 years. It was constructed hastily under impossible conditions, and engineers knew it had significant weaknesses. Parts of it rested on structurally damaged portions of the reactor building. There were gaps in the walls and roof that allowed rain and snow to enter, and the radiation inside was so intense that no one could enter to properly inspect or maintain most of it. Over the years, concerns grew about the sarcophagus's stability. The radiation inside was causing the concrete to degrade, and the steel supports were corroding. Engineers warned that a partial or complete collapse was possible, which could release massive amounts of radioactive dust and contaminate the surrounding area once again. The structure also didn't completely contain the radiation. Studies showed that radiation was leaking through cracks and gaps. In 2016, after years of planning and construction, an enormous new containment structure called the New Safe Confinement was completed and slid into place over the old sarcophagus. This structure, one of the largest movable land-based structures ever built, is designed to last 100 years and will allow for the eventual dismantling of the old sarcophagus and removal of radioactive materials. The project cost approximately 2.1 billion euros, funded by international donors, representing one of the largest international cooperation projects in history. Following the evacuation of Pripyat and surrounding areas, Soviet authorities established what would become known as the Chernobyl exclusion zone, an area initially covering 30 kilometers around the destroyed reactor where human habitation was prohibited due to radioactive contamination. This zone would eventually be expanded to cover approximately 2,600 square kilometers in Ukraine and an additional 2,100 square kilometers in neighboring Belarus. The creation of the exclusion zone represented an unprecedented peacetime displacement of civilian populations. In addition to Pripyat's 49,000 residents, approximately 68,000 people from 187 settlements were evacuated in the weeks and months following the disaster. These communities range from small villages where families had lived for generations to larger towns that served the agricultural regions of northern Ukraine. The evacuations were traumatic and often chaotic. Many residents were given little time to prepare, and the authorities maintained the fiction that the displacement was temporary even as they implemented measures that suggested permanence. Pets were not allowed on evacuation buses, leading to heartbreaking scenes of animals being left behind. Many of these abandoned pets would later be shot by liquidators to prevent them from spreading contamination or suffering slow deaths from radiation exposure. Within the exclusion zone, a surreal landscape emerged. Towns and villages stood frozen in time, with belongings left behind in homes, vehicles abandoned on streets, and public spaces silent where they had once been filled with life. Pripyat's amusement park, which had been scheduled to open on May 1, 1986, for the May Day celebrations, stood as a particularly poignant symbol. The Ferris wheel that was never used, the bumper cars that carried no joyful riders. The Soviet authorities implemented various decontamination measures within parts of the exclusion zone. These included removing and burying topsoil, demolishing heavily contaminated buildings, and cutting down forests that had absorbed high levels of radiation. The so-called Red Forest, an area of pine trees that turned bright red and died after absorbing extreme radiation doses, was bulldozed and buried. Despite official prohibitions, not everyone left the exclusion zone permanently. In the months and years after the evacuation, several hundred elderly residents, mostly women, returned to their homes in the zone. These self-settlers, or samosli, as they're known in Russian and Ukrainian, defied government orders to return to villages where they had spent their entire lives. Many were elderly collective farm workers who preferred to live out their remaining years in their ancestral homes rather than in apartments in unfamiliar cities. The authorities eventually adopted a pragmatic approach to these self-settlers, providing some support while officially maintaining that the zone was off-limits. By the 2010s, only a few dozen of these original returnees remained alive, most having died of old age. Their presence added a human dimension to a landscape otherwise dominated by abandonment and decay. Over time, nature began to reclaim the exclusion zone in unexpected ways. Without human activity, forests expanded and wildlife populations flourished despite the radiation. Wolves, bears, lynx, eagles, and other species became more abundant within the zone than in surrounding inhabited areas. This didn't mean the radiation was harmless. Studies have documented genetic mutations, increased tumor rates, and other effects in wildlife populations. However, the absence of human activity appeared to benefit wildlife more than radiation harmed it. Among all those affected by the Chernobyl disaster, children bore an especially heavy burden. Their developing bodies were more vulnerable to radiation than adults, and many received substantial exposures during the critical hours and days after the explosion, when authorities delayed evacuation and provided no warnings about contamination. The consequences of these exposures would manifest in devastating ways in the years that followed. The most dramatic health effect observed in children was a massive increase in thyroid cancer. The thyroid gland concentrates iodine from the bloodstream, and when radioactive iodine, 131, was released in the reactor, it was absorbed by the thyroid glands of exposed individuals. Children's thyroids are particularly active and concentrate more iodine than adults, making them especially vulnerable. In the years following the disaster, doctors began observing unprecedented rates of thyroid cancer in children from contaminated regions of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. Before Chernobyl, thyroid cancer in children was extremely rare, with perhaps 1 or 2 cases per million children annually. In heavily contaminated regions of Belarus, rates surged to more than 100 cases per million children in some birth cohorts. By 2005, more than 6,000 cases of thyroid cancer had been diagnosed in people who were children or adolescents at the time of the accident. Most of these cancers were successfully treated through surgery and other interventions, but the psychological impact of childhood cancer, the need for lifelong thyroid hormone replacement therapy, and the ongoing fear of recurrence created lasting burdens for these individuals and their families. The thyroid cancer epidemic was worsened by Soviet authorities' failure to implement basic protective measures. One of the simplest and most effective interventions for protecting against radioactive iodine exposure is the distribution of potassium iodide tablets. When non-radioactive iodine is taken in pill form, it saturates the thyroid gland and prevents it from absorbing radioactive iodine from the environment. Several countries in Europe distributed these pills to their populations when the Chernobyl cloud passed over. However, Soviet authorities failed to distribute potassium iodide to the populations in Ukraine and Belarus, leaving children unprotected. Another critical failure involved the food supply. Milk from cows that had eaten contaminated grass became a major source of radioactive iodine exposure for children. Had authorities immediately banned consumption of fresh milk from the contaminated regions, many exposures could have been prevented. Instead, contaminated milk continued to be consumed for weeks after the accident as authorities failed to establish proper controls. Beyond thyroid cancer, concerns emerge about other potential health effects in children exposed to Chernobyl radiation. Studies have examined rates of leukemia, birth defects, and other cancers in exposed populations. The results have been mixed and sometimes controversial, with some studies suggesting elevated risks and others finding no clear increases beyond what would be expected from thyroid cancer. Recent genetic studies have provided some reassuring news. Research examining the children of Chernobyl survivors, those who were exposed to radiation and later had children, found no evidence of elevated rates of genetic mutations transmitted to the next generation. This suggests that while radiation exposure caused health problems in the exposed generation, it did not create heritable genetic damage that would affect their descendants. However, the psychological and social impacts on children extended beyond physical health effects. Children from contaminated regions face stigmatization, with some people fearing that Chernobyl children might be contagious or genetically damaged. Families dealt with ongoing anxiety about health, economic disruption from evacuations and resettlement, and the trauma of having their lives upended by forces beyond their control. The Soviet government's response to Chernobyl was characterized by secrecy, denial, and a fundamental unwillingness to acknowledge the scale of the disaster. This pattern of cover-up began immediately after the explosion and continued for years, compounding the tragedy by preventing effective responses and exposing populations to unnecessary radiation. For the first 2 days after the explosion, Soviet authorities released no public information about what had happened. While radiation detectors across Europe were registering alarmingly high readings and the radioactive cloud was spreading across the continent, the Soviet government remained silent. It wasn't until April 28th, when Swedish scientists confronted Soviet officials with evidence of massive radiation releases, that the USSR finally acknowledged an accident had occurred at Chernobyl. Even then, official statements downplayed the severity. Initial reports claimed there had been a minor accident at the power plant, that the situation was under control, and that radiation releases were limited. Soviet television news mentioned the accident briefly, providing minimal details and offering reassurances that belied the reality of catastrophe unfolding in Ukraine. This culture of secrecy extended to how authorities treated their own citizens. Residents of Pripyat and surrounding areas were given no warnings about radiation danger for more than 36 hours after the explosion. Children played outside, people went to work, and daily life continued while invisible radiation contaminated everything around them. The delay in evacuation and failure to provide basic safety information resulted in exposures that could have been significantly reduced with prompt action. The patterns of denial extended to causes of the accident. Soviet authorities initially blamed the disaster entirely on operator error, presenting the narrative that reckless actions by the plant workers had caused an accident in an otherwise safe reactor design. While operator errors certainly contributed to the disaster, this narrative obscured fundamental design flaws in the RBMK reactor. The RBMK design had a dangerous characteristic known as a positive void coefficient. This meant that under certain conditions, as water in the reactor boiled and formed steam bubbles, voids, the nuclear reaction would increase rather than decrease. This made the reactor inherently unstable at low power levels. Additionally, the design of the control rods had a flaw where inserting them into the reactor initially caused a brief increase in reactivity before they began to absorb neutrons and shut down the reaction. This positive scram effect may have contributed to the reactor's destruction when operators pressed the emergency shutdown button. Soviet authorities were aware of these design flaws before Chernobyl. There have been previous incidents at other RBMK reactors that revealed dangerous characteristics of the design. However, this information was classified and not shared even with reactor operators, leaving them unaware of the risks they faced. After Chernobyl, the Soviet Union retrofitted its remaining RBMK reactors with design modifications to address some of these problems, implicitly acknowledging that the reactor design itself bore responsibility for the disaster. The suppression of accurate information extended to health effects. Soviet medical authorities were reluctant to acknowledge the full scope of radiation-related illnesses in exposed populations. Studies conducted by Soviet scientists that documented elevated health risks were sometimes suppressed or dismissed. This pattern of denial made it difficult for affected populations to receive appropriate medical care and compensation. The political environment of the Soviet Union in 1986 contributed to this culture of cover-up. The USSR was a system where bad news was unwelcome, where officials feared being blamed for failures, and where admitting problems could be interpreted as criticism of the socialist system itself. The nuclear power program was a source of Soviet pride, and acknowledging fundamental design flaws in Soviet reactor technology was politically unpalatable. The economic costs of the Chernobyl disaster were staggering and continued to accumulate decades later. These costs extended far beyond the immediate expenses of the emergency response and contaminated areas cleanup to include long-term health care, ongoing environmental monitoring and management, lost productivity, and the economic disruption caused by the evacuation and resettlement of hundreds of thousands of people. The immediate response costs were enormous. The liquidation operation involved hundreds of thousands of workers over several years, requiring massive logistical support, specialized equipment, and extensive decontamination efforts. The construction of the sarcophagus alone involved more than 300,000 tons of concrete and 7,000 tons of metal framework, all assembled under extraordinarily difficult and dangerous conditions. Belarus, which received approximately 60% of the fallout from Chernobyl despite not having the reactor on its territory, faced particularly severe economic impacts. The country lost access to approximately 20% of its agricultural land due to contamination. Forests that provided timber and were sites for traditional activities, like mushroom gathering, became too contaminated for use. The cost of health care for affected populations, decontamination efforts, and social support for evacuees consumed a significant portion of the national budget for years. Ukraine faced similar burdens despite being somewhat wealthier than Belarus. The evacuation and permanent resettlement of more than 100,000 people required providing new housing, infrastructure, and employment in uncontaminated regions. The exclusion zone removed productive agricultural and forestry land from use indefinitely. The town of Pripyat had been a modern, prosperous city that represented significant capital investment, all of which was abandoned. Russia, though less affected than Ukraine and Belarus in terms of contamination, still faced substantial costs related to health care for liquidators and evacuated populations, as well as its share of the cleanup expenses. Many liquidators were Russian citizens who later required medical care and social support for radiation-related illnesses. The Soviet Union initially claimed that the disaster would cost around 2 billion rubles. This estimate proved wildly inadequate. By the time the USSR dissolved in 1991, estimates suggested the disaster had cost the Soviet economy 18 billion rubles, equivalent to roughly $18 billion at the time. However, these figures captured only direct costs and didn't account for long-term expenses. After the Soviet Union's collapse, the newly independent states of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia continued to bear enormous costs. A 2003 estimate suggested that Belarus alone had spent $13 billion on Chernobyl-related expenses since the disaster, representing a significant portion of the national GDP. Ukraine estimated its Chernobyl-related costs at $148 billion over the first 25 years after the accident. These national expenditures included ongoing health care and social support for affected populations. Under Soviet and post-Soviet law, people who received certain radiation doses or lived in contaminated areas were entitled to various benefits, including enhanced health care, pensions, and other forms of compensation. Managing these programs and verifying eligibility created both substantial costs and bureaucratic challenges. The disaster also had significant costs for Western Europe. Countries across the continent had to implement agricultural restrictions, dispose of contaminated food products, and monitor contamination levels. Even today, decades after the disaster, some regions in Europe maintain restrictions on certain foods due to lingering contamination. The Chernobyl disaster fundamentally transformed the global nuclear power industry and forced a reckoning with questions about nuclear safety, reactor design, and the institutional cultures surrounding nuclear energy. The accident revealed that catastrophic failures were possible and that the consequences could extend across continents and generations. In the immediate aftermath, the international nuclear community had to grapple with the reality that Soviet reactor designs had fundamental flaws. The RBMK reactor design used at Chernobyl was particular to the Soviet Union and differed significantly from reactor designs used in Western countries. Western reactors generally employed a negative void coefficient, meaning that if cooling water began to boil, the nuclear reaction would naturally decrease rather than accelerate. However, Chernobyl revealed that reactor design alone was insufficient to ensure safety. The accident occurred because multiple safety systems were deliberately disabled during a test that violated operating procedures. This pointed to deeper issues around safety culture, operator training, and institutional oversight. In response to Chernobyl, the nuclear industry worldwide implemented significant changes. Safety standards were enhanced, with new requirements for containment structures, emergency cooling systems, and redundant safety mechanisms. The International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, strengthened its safety monitoring and created new frameworks for international cooperation on nuclear safety. Western countries with nuclear power programs reviewed their own safety practices and made upgrades. Containment structures, which were weak or absent in the RBMK design, were reinforced or added to existing plants. Emergency response planning was enhanced, and coordination mechanisms for international notification in response to nuclear accidents were established. The Soviet Union itself made significant changes to its remaining RBMK reactors. Modifications were implemented to address the positive scram effect and other design vulnerabilities. Enhanced safety systems were installed, and operational procedures were revised. The 3 undamaged reactors at Chernobyl continued operating for years after the disaster. The last unit didn't shut down until 2000. Despite these improvements, Chernobyl dealt a severe blow to nuclear power's public image worldwide. Anti-nuclear movements gained strength, and plans for new nuclear plant were canceled or delayed in many countries. Italy held a referendum that resulted in the phase-out of its nuclear program. Germany ultimately decided to phase out nuclear power entirely, a process that has extended over decades. The disaster also highlighted the unique challenges of nuclear technology. Unlike other industrial accidents that primarily affect workers or nearby communities, a nuclear disaster can contaminate vast areas and create long-lasting consequences. The difficulty and cost of cleanup, the long timescales involved in radioactive decay, and the potential for transnational contamination make nuclear accidents categorically different from most other technological failures. Chernobyl became a case study in risk assessment and the question of acceptable risk in complex technological systems. Before Chernobyl, catastrophic nuclear accidents were considered so unlikely that they could be essentially discounted in risk calculations. Chernobyl demonstrated that low-probability, high-consequence events can and do occur, forcing a reassessment of how we think about technological risk. Beyond its immediate humanitarian and environmental impacts, the Chernobyl disaster sent shockwaves through Soviet politics and international relations that arguably contributed to the eventual collapse of the USSR. The accident exposed fundamental weaknesses in the Soviet system and eroded both domestic confidence and international prestige at a critical moment in history. The disaster occurred during the early years of Mikhail Gorbachev's leadership of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev had come to power in 1985 with a mandate for reform, introducing policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika restructuring, aimed at revitalizing the Soviet economy and political system. Chernobyl became an immediate test of these reform policies. The initial cover-up and denial of the disaster contradicted the principles of glasnost. For 2 days, as radiation spread across Europe, Soviet authorities said nothing. When they finally acknowledged the accident, they downplayed its severity. This pattern of secrecy damaged Gorbachev's credibility both domestically and internationally. However, Chernobyl also became a catalyst for greater openness. The impossibility of hiding the disaster from international scrutiny, Swedish scientists had already detected it, forced a degree of transparency that was unprecedented for the Soviet Union. In the weeks and months following the accident, Soviet media provided more extensive and candid coverage of problems than would have been conceivable in earlier eras. Gorbachev himself later acknowledged Chernobyl's importance in transforming the Soviet Union. In his memoir, he wrote that Chernobyl was perhaps the real cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union 5 years later. The disaster exposed the system's inability to manage complex technological challenges and its tendency towards secrecy and denial even when openness might have mitigated consequences. The accident undermined Soviet claims of technological prowess. The USSR had promoted its nuclear program as evidence of socialist achievement, proof that the Soviet system could match or exceed Western technological capabilities. Chernobyl shattered this narrative, revealing instead dangerous design flaws, inadequate safety cultures, and systemic weaknesses. Internationally, Chernobyl affected Cold War dynamics in complex ways. Western countries offer assistance and expertise, creating opportunities for cooperation that would have been unusual just a few years earlier. The shared nature of the threat, radiation recognizes no borders, reinforced a reality that some challenges transcend ideological divisions. The disaster also inflamed nationalist tensions within the Soviet Union. Ukraine and Belarus bore the brunt of contamination and economic costs, while decisions were made in Moscow. This dynamic contributed to growing resentment and strengthened independence movements that would culminate in the USSR's dissolution in 1991. The economic burden of Chernobyl came at the worst possible time for the Soviet economy. The USSR was already struggling with stagnation, inefficiency, and the cost of maintaining military parity with the West. The addition of tens of billions of rubles in Chernobyl-related expenses to an already strained budget worsened the economic crisis that would help bring down the Soviet system. Chernobyl created an unprecedented opportunity for studying the effects of radiation exposure on human populations and ecosystems. While this opportunity came at a terrible human cost, the research conducted in the aftermath has profoundly shaped our understanding of radiation biology, environmental contamination, and disaster response. The most significant findings have concerned thyroid cancer in children. The dramatic increase in thyroid cancer rates in exposed populations provided clear evidence of radiation's carcinogenic effects and helped establish dose-response relationships. This research has improved our understanding of radiation risk assessment and informed protective measures for nuclear workers and populations living near nuclear facilities. Studies of liquidators and other highly exposed populations have provided data on acute radiation syndrome and long-term health effects of significant radiation exposure. This research has tragic value. It helps medical professionals understand and treat radiation injuries, knowledge that could be crucial in future nuclear accidents or radiological emergencies. The genetic studies of Chernobyl survivors and their children have yielded important findings. Research published in 2021 found that children born to parents who were exposed to Chernobyl radiation did not show elevated rates of genetic mutations compared to control populations. This suggests that while radiation exposure causes health problems in the exposed generation, it doesn't create heritable genetic damage at the doses most people received. The Chernobyl exclusion zone has become a unique natural laboratory for studying ecosystem responses to radiation and human absence. The zone represents one of the largest unintentional experiments in radioecology ever conducted. Researchers have studied how wildlife populations respond to chronic low-level radiation exposure in the absence of human activity. Findings from this research have been complex and sometimes surprising. Wildlife populations of many species are abundant in the exclusion zone despite measurable radiation exposure. Studies have documented genetic mutations, elevated tumor rates, and other health effects in some animal populations. Yet overall biodiversity appears higher than in comparable areas outside the zone. This suggests that for many species, the elimination of human activity provides benefits that outweigh the cost of radiation exposure. However, interpretation of these ecological findings remains controversial among scientists. Some researchers argue that radiation is having significant negative effects on wildlife that are obscured by the absence of human disturbance. Others maintain that the effects, while measurable, are relatively modest compared to the impact of human activity. This ongoing scientific debate reflects both the complexity of ecological systems and the challenges of studying radiation effects in the wild. The disaster also advanced the field of environmental remediation. The massive cleanup operation tested various decontamination techniques and strategies. While many approaches proved only partially effective, you cannot truly clean radiation in many cases. Only remove contaminated material and put it somewhere else. The experience gained has informed responses to other radiological incidents. Chernobyl research has contributed to improved radiation protection standards and guidelines. Organizations like the International Commission on Radiological Protection have revised their recommendations based partly on evidence from Chernobyl. These revisions affect radiation safety standards worldwide, protecting nuclear workers, medical professionals who work with radiation, and the general public. Behind the statistics, scientific studies, and political analyses of Chernobyl lie countless individual human stories of tragedy, courage, resilience, and loss. These personal narratives give human dimension to the disaster and remind us that the true cost of Chernobyl is measured not just in economics or health statistics, but in disrupted lives and broken dreams. Lyudmila Ignatenko's story, mentioned earlier, became one of the most well-known to the book Voices from Chernobyl. Her account of staying with her dying husband despite warnings, of watching him deteriorate from a healthy young man to someone barely recognizable, of losing her newborn daughter, captures the intimate human tragedy that repeated itself thousands of times in different variations. The liquidators who served at Chernobyl carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Many developed chronic health problems that they and their doctors believed were related to radiation exposure. Whether or not these health problems were always directly caused by radiation, the men who served as liquidators lived with uncertainty, fear, and often inadequate medical care and social support. Some liquidators described feeling pride in their service, believing they prevented an even greater catastrophe. Others expressed bitterness at how they were treated, feeling they had been sent into danger without proper information or protection, and then abandoned once they were no longer needed. Many struggle with the question of whether their service had been necessary heroism or unnecessary sacrifice resulting from systemic failures. The evacuees from Pripyat and other communities faced the trauma of sudden displacement. Families lost homes, possessions, and the social networks of communities where they had lived for generations. Many evacuees were relocated to hastily constructed apartments in unfamiliar cities, where they faced economic challenges, discrimination, and the psychological burden of being Chernobyl refugees. Some evacuees described feeling like strangers in their own country, stigmatized by association with Chernobyl. Children from evacuated families faced bullying at new schools, and adults struggled to find employment as some feared contamination. These social effects compounded the physical and economic hardships of displacement. The elderly residents who returned to live in the exclusion zone represent another dimension of the human story. For these individuals, mostly women who had spent their entire lives in rural villages, the attachment to their land and homes was stronger than the fear of radiation. They lived out their final years in familiar surroundings, tending gardens and maintaining traditions, choosing quality of life over quantity. Parents whose children developed thyroid cancer or other radiation-related illnesses carried burdens of fear and guilt. Some blamed themselves for not leaving sooner or for allowing their children to drink contaminated milk. The knowledge that these illnesses might have been prevented with different decisions by authorities added anger to the grief. The workers who remained at the Chernobyl plant after the accident, operating the 3 undamaged reactors until the last one shut down in 2000, lived with daily reminders of the disaster. They worked in the shadow of the sarcophagus, knowing that just hundreds of meters away lay the destroyed reactor that had claimed so many lives. Their continued operation of these reactors, deemed necessary for Ukraine's electrical grid, require remarkable psychological resilience. Nearly 4 decades after the explosion, Chernobyl remains a powerful warning about the risks of nuclear technology, the dangers of secrecy and institutional failure, and humanity's complex relationship with the powerful forces we have learned to harness. The disaster continues to shape policies, influence cultural narratives, and serve as a reference point for discussions about technological risk. The site itself will remain dangerous for thousands of years. Radioactive isotopes like cesium-137 and strontium-90 will take centuries to decay to safe levels, while plutonium in the reactor remains will be hazardous for tens of thousands of years. The new safe confinement completed in 2016 is designed to last 100 years, but this is merely a temporary solution to a problem that will extend far beyond any human institution's planning horizon. The management of the exclusion zone represents an ongoing challenge that will need to continue indefinitely. The area must be monitored, access controlled, and the aging confinement structure eventually replaced or maintained. This represents a commitment of resources and attention that will extend across generations who had no role in creating the problem. Chernobyl has become a cultural touchstone, referenced in literature, film, television, and popular culture. The HBO miniseries Chernobyl introduced a new generation to the disaster and sparked renewed public interest in nuclear safety issues. The site has become a destination for dark tourism, with thousands of visitors touring the exclusion zone each year before the COVID-19 pandemic and recent conflicts disrupted access. The disaster raises profound questions about intergenerational ethics and responsibility. The decisions made in designing the RBMK reactor and operating the Chernobyl plant in April 1986 created consequences that will extend for centuries. This challenges us to think about how we can make decisions about technologies with long-term consequences when our institutions and planning horizons are necessarily limited. Chernobyl also demonstrates the transnational nature of modern risks. Radiation released in Ukraine contaminated ecosystems across Europe, affecting people who had no connection to the Soviet nuclear program. This reality of shared vulnerability across borders reinforces the need for international cooperation in managing technological risks. The ongoing health and social impacts remind us that disaster consequences extend far beyond the immediate event. People are still dealing with Chernobyl-related health problems, economic disruptions, and psychological trauma decades later. The full accounting of Chernobyl's costs may not be possible until the last person directly affected has died. For the nuclear industry, Chernobyl remains both a warning and a case study. The disaster demonstrated that low-probability, high-consequence events can occur and that multiple layers of safety systems and procedures are necessary but not sufficient. It reinforced the importance of safety culture, transparency, and the willingness to learn from mistakes. The disaster also speaks to broader themes about technological hubris and the limits of human control. The engineers and operators at Chernobyl believed they understood and controlled the reactor right up until the moment it exploded. This pattern of overconfidence followed by catastrophic failure has parallels in other technological disasters and serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating complexity and risk. As we face new technological challenges in the 21st century, from artificial intelligence to genetic engineering to climate change mitigation, Chernobyl offers lessons. It reminds us that our technologies can have consequences we don't fully anticipate, that institutional failures can turn technical problems into catastrophes, and that some mistakes create burdens that extend across generations. The destroyed reactor at Chernobyl, entombed in its steel and concrete shell, stands as a monument to human ambition, failure, courage, and tragedy. It is a place where heroes sacrificed themselves to prevent greater catastrophe, where institutional failures compounded technical problems, where the invisible force of radiation altered countless lives, and where humanity confronted the consequences of harnessing one of nature's most powerful forces. The story of Chernobyl is ultimately a human story, one that destroyed a generation, but also revealed extraordinary courage, resilience, and the capacity to learn from even our most terrible mistakes. The story of Chernobyl is a stark reminder that the decisions we make today can echo through generations. If you found this deep dive into one of history's most devastating disasters eye-opening, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more untold stories that shaped our world. What aspect of the Chernobyl disaster shocked you the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you want to see more content about historical events that change humanity forever, click that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Remember, understanding our past mistakes is the first step to ensuring we don't repeat them in the future. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.